Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today's interview is with Dr. Frank von Hippel, who is professor of ecotoxicology at Northern Arizona University and author of the new book, The Chemical Age: How Chemists Fought Famine and Disease, Killed Millions, and Changed Our Relationship with the Earth. Today, we're going to be talking about what ecotoxicology is, different areas of his research. We're going to talk about our history with pestilence and pesticides, as well as our modern day dilemmas, along with COVID-19. So stay tuned and please enjoy the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Frank von Hippel. Dr. von Hippel is professor of ecotoxicology at Northern Arizona University. Frank was born and raised in Alaska, received his A.B. in biology at Dartmouth College in 1986, and his Ph.D. in integrative biology at the University of California, Berkeley in 1996. He taught for Columbia University and the University of Alaska Anchorage before moving to Arizona in 2016. Frank has taught ecology field courses in over 20 countries and conducted research in the Americas, Africa, and Australia. Frank's research has been widely covered in the press, including the New York Times and National Public Radio. And he's here to discuss his history of research, past and present, and also his new book, which is a wonderful read called The Chemical Age: How Chemists Fought Famine and Disease, Killed Millions, and Changed Our Relationship with the Earth. Good morning, Frank. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Great, Ailey. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you and discuss all your work. Let me start with the very basic information. So you are professor of ecotoxicology at Northern Arizona University. So what is ecotoxicology?
Well, most people have heard about toxicology, which is the study of how contaminants or any kind of foreign molecule in the body might affect your physiology or health. Ecotoxicology is looking at contaminants at the level of the ecosystem. So in my case, I study how contaminants affect the environment, including wildlife, for example, their health, how contaminants move through food webs, but then also how contaminants affect people in the environment. I work with a lot of underserved communities like indigenous populations around the world, migrant farm workers, people who are exposed to chemicals through their work, through where they live, and how those chemicals may impact their health.
It's fascinating. And so give me some specifics in some of your past research that you're looking at fish, you're looking at all different varieties of living organisms. Give me some anecdotal stories of what you've looked at and some of your surprises.
Sure. So I do work in the lab with fish as a model organism to understand how contaminants affect development, affect gene expression, all kinds of things. And then I work in the field with whatever animals might be the most appropriate for the problem. So the kind of paradigm that we follow in my lab is called a One Health approach, where we're looking at environmental health, human health, and animal health all at the same time. And we do this all over the world. I have projects in Alaska working with tribal communities. I have some projects that are strictly with wildlife, like an endangered fish project in California, projects on wildlife and a wetland in Chile, and mangrove forests in Ecuador, wildlife affected by an industrial spill in a nature reserve in Israel, and then other projects that are really focused on human health but have an animal component, like working with migrant Mexican farm workers on the U.S.-Mexico border, working Mayan communities in Guatemala, working with Aboriginal community in Australia. So a variety of different projects around the world, but all following this One Health approach.
That's wonderful. So you have this wonderful new book. Looks like it took you 9 years to write.
It did indeed, yeah.
Labor of love. And the book is called The Chemical Age: How Chemists Fought Famine and Disease, Killed Millions, and Changed Our Relationship with the Earth. So I read your book in preparation for our interview, and I was just overwhelmed by the enormous amount of research involved, the attention to detail, how it was meticulously referenced. And it was also very personal as well. Tell our audience a little bit about your book and how you sort of organized it and who the intended audience is.
Sure. So the book is organized into 4 sections. There's There's a section first on famine, and that's looking at how scientists were trying to develop chemicals to fight famine. And up until we had effective ways to defeat famine, this was a constant problem for humanity. So he uses the Irish potato famine as the example of this. It was the most devastating famine ever recorded at that time in the middle of the 1800s. And the second section is on pandemics, which of course is quite relevant to what we're going through now, though I did not, of course, anticipate that we would be in the middle of a pandemic when the book would come out. And in that section, I look at 4 pandemics that are different in the way that they're carried by animal vectors and the way that they were combated and the way that the pathogen was discovered. So I look at malaria, yellow fever, bubonic plague, and typhus. And then the third section is on war. And this is because so many chemicals that were designed to kill pests, whether they're vectors of disease or pests that kill plants and cause famine, are also used as chemical weapons. And so many chemical weapons were also developed into pesticides. So there's this incredible interplay between the development of effective pesticides and the development of effective chemical weapons to kill people. And then the fourth section is on the emergence of ecology. So how did the broad-scale use of these chemicals throughout the world lead to the emergence of the environmental movement?
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary storyline, to be honest with you, because you're really looking at history and how it plays off of our current, it reflects very interestingly on our current situation. Going back and learning about the germ theory of infectious disease, there were some really, things I haven't looked at in many years. Could you talk to us a little bit about the germ theory of infectious disease and how, not seeing and feeling and touching a lot of these microbes back even to the plague and moving forward, how did that play into people's approach for, I would say, even prevention from other people getting ill and believability of science back then as well, if you couldn't see and touch it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it relates to many of the same issues we're having right now. So the germ theory of infectious disease was primarily developed by 2 scientists, Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany. And they worked simultaneously. They were competitors trying to solve what is it that causes infectious diseases. And they simultaneously came up with this concept that diseases are caused by microscopic organisms, what you would call germs, what they call germs. And before that discovery, and they proved this was the case over and over again, before that discovery, people had no way to effectively combat pandemics or epidemics because they didn't understand the cause. They didn't understand the transmission. And without understanding what causes disease and how diseases are spread, you're really helpless in doing anything about it. And this extends to diseases of plants, too. So I mentioned the Irish potato famine, which was set up by the structure of the British government, how they treated Ireland. But the proximate cause of the pandemic was a water mold called Phytophthora infestans. It's a microscopic fungus-like organism that destroyed the potato crops. So here you have something that caused over 1 million Irish people to die, over 1 million Irish people to flee Ireland. And without understanding what the cause was, what the organism was, and how it was transmitted, they had no hope of solving the problem. So the germ theory of infectious disease, one way to think about it is before that the understanding of what causes disease and the ideas of how to stop it, you could expect probably half of your children would die during childhood. And how can you live a secure, happy life if your expectation is half your kids are going to die? But that was the reality for all of human history up until that point. Suddenly, with the work of Pasteur and Koch, we had ways to combat disease and ways to see hope that we could survive diseases and flourish despite those diseases.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Just thinking of pasteurization, which many people know as pasteurized milk, and that was Louis Pasteur. And these are current things that we use in today's modern world in terms of just having less sickness through our food. And yet this was something that was really key back in the day, especially I guess after the invention of the microscope in the late 1600s, right? So then they could actually start to see what might be the cause of some of the ills. right?
That's right. So the microscope was an essential tool to have, but it took a few centuries after that before it could be used effectively for this purpose. But there were so many things that came out of this, like antiseptic techniques in surgery. So Lister came up with that about 10 years after the advent of the germ theory of disease.
Is that Listerine? Is that like the connection to Lister?
Yeah. And he took that theory and applied it to surgery and showed that if you use sterile techniques in surgery, you could avoid infection. And you think back to Civil War days, you were probably more likely to die of a battle injury if you got treatment in a hospital during the Civil War than if you avoided treatment, because you would end up getting infected by the surgeon using the same tools on you as was used on everybody else. And so every aspect of our lives improved immeasurably by having this scientific advance of understanding what causes disease and how to prevent disease.
I thought it was particularly interesting about your section, your talk discussion about malaria, because malaria was something that no one really could believe was transmitted by a vector such as a mosquito. Where here you were talking about plant-based vectors, such as molds causing blight. And here you have malaria that's causing such an enormous loss of life throughout the world, and that there's some protective mechanism. I mean, as a physician, I find this so fascinating that there's a protective evolutionary mechanism from those who lived and evolved through Africa, parts of Africa. And what was kind of, when I read it, I thought, that seems really interesting, because now we're looking at COVID, and we're seeing that there may be some information regarding ABO blood types that may confer some resistance or reduced expression of inflammatory expression on exposure. So could you tie those together in some way that you find unique or interesting?
Sure. So in fact, at the same time that Pasteur and Koch were developing the germ theory of disease, Charles Darwin was developing the theory of evolution by natural selection and the rest of his evolutionary theories. And they really tie in together because these scientists, they all knew of each other's work, and you had to understand that organisms could evolve to also come up with this idea that there's a germ basis to disease, a microorganism basis, and that there will be resistant individuals to those diseases. So malaria is the classic case, and multiple times in malarious regions of the world, people have evolved resistance to malaria through a mutation that imparted resistance to getting the disease. The most famous example of this is sickle cell anemia, which evolved in equatorial Africa. And this is a mutation. It's a recessive mutation that when the individual has one copy of the mutated allele, the recessive allele, and one normal copy, they still have normal oxygen carrying capacity, but they have resistance to the amoeba-like organism that causes malaria to impact their blood cells. And as a result, people who are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia are resistant to malaria. People who are homozygous recessive, that is, they have both copies of the mutated allele, end up with severe malaria, and they tend to die fairly young. People who are homozygous dominant, who have the normal genotype, are normal in oxygen carrying capacity, but they are not resistant to malaria. So this is one of the reasons that slavery became entrenched in the Western Hemisphere, because when the Europeans first arrived in the Western Hemisphere, they enslaved the indigenous people, and they also had indentured European servants. But both of them were dying in huge numbers from the diseases that Europeans brought over with them, like yellow fever and malaria. And so they ended up bringing over equatorial African slaves because they had genetic resistance to malaria through the sickle cell trait. They also had acquired immunity to yellow fever because they were typically infected as children with yellow fever with a more benign form, and therefore had resistance. So they were much more effective as laborers because they were not dying of these diseases in the same kinds of numbers. So it relates to all aspects of society. Malaria has been the number one killer of humanity for the last 10,000 years. It began as an epidemic disease with the advent of agriculture, because that meant that people lived around the breeding water source for Anopheles mosquitoes, and there were ready blood meals for the mosquitoes.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And we're going to see probably how, evolution, even, as more and more information comes out with coronavirus, how, this may shape how we, travel, interact, God knows, marry. I mean, who knows how this could end up being a dystopian horror story, but essentially how evolution plays a key role in modern day, even now with coronavirus. So that'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I have a question or two about the next sections that you talked about, sort of the age of chemicals that were the discovery of many, chemicals that were meant to have some good properties and to serve humanity well. And a lot of chemicals that were used and went off the tracks and are used as killing machines. Tell us how World War I started to shape that picture.
Yeah, so World War I is really a key turning event in chemical history because before World War I, just about all of the chemicals used in agriculture were metal-based toxic metals that were incorporated for use in preventing insect outbreaks or fungus outbreaks in crops. So it was a really simple chemical story in terms of agriculture. But during World War I, both the French and the Russians tried to use chlorine gas at the beginning of the war as a chemical weapon, but they were ineffective. The first army to do it effectively was the German army, and that effort was led by Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber was already world famous for his synthesis of ammonium out of the atmosphere, out of atmospheric nitrogen to make fertilizer, which averted world hunger, averted famines for ever since. Because before that time, the agriculture was limited by the lack of nitrogen fertilizers, which were mostly mined in Chilean caliche deposits in northern Chile. So during World War I, Haber figured out how to effectively deliver chlorine gas as a weapon. And the first use of it was in Belgium on the battlefield. And then World War I became a chemical war with both sides retaliating with ever more toxic, more potent chemicals. By the end of World War I, a quarter of the artillery that was sailing over the trenches had chemical weapons in it, which is just extraordinary. So many of those chemicals that were developed during World War I as chemical weapons were then, after the war, converted into pesticides, especially insecticides. And then when we get to World War II, we saw the development of two major new classes of pesticides. One are the organochlorine pesticides. The first of these was DDT. That was its insecticidal properties were discovered by a Swiss chemist, Paul Mueller, right at the beginning of World War II, just before the war. And the second are the organophosphate insecticides, which were discovered by the Nazi scientist Schrader during World War II, but he was looking for effective insecticides, but he found these chemicals were so toxic that they would need to be militarized rather than used as insecticides. And the first one he synthesized was the nerve agent tabin, and the second one was the nerve agent sarin. And then a colleague of his developed soman. And these were the most toxic chemical weapons ever developed until that time. After World War II, those organophosphate those organophosphate nerve agents were developed into the most used insecticides on the planet. So in the 60s and 70s, the most used were the organochlorine, and the 50s, the organochlorine insecticides, and then by the 80s and 90s, organophosphate insecticides had replaced them.
So we now have this, how many active, trademarked, allowable pesticides in the U.S. are there approximately now?
Well, there are thousands, and there are also many of those have many different formulations, either the concentrations used or the combination of the active ingredient with other chemicals that are employed with that compound.
The inactive ingredients, yeah.
Yeah, and we're still using the older compounds too. We still use metal-based fungicides such as copper and manganese. So copper sulfate was actually the first commercialized pesticide. It was developed in the 1870s in France, and it became the first insecticide that was commercially produced, and we still use that today. Bordeaux mixture is its common name. So we have the older stuff, but we also have all of these newer classes and many classes that developed after the war, like the carbamates, the neonicotinoids, which are now the most widely used insecticide. They're a synthetic version of nicotine. And
which are
other
implicated
newer
in the bee population reduction. I mean, I know that's what gets the most media in regards to that class of pesticides affecting the bees around the world, including the U.S., right?
Yeah, neonicotinoids are involved in colony collapse disorder of honeybees and bumblebees, and they're also involved in bird declines, as are all of these other pesticides. So they all have environmental consequences that are quite severe, and
human health, right? I mean, now wouldn't you say that they're now finding, I mean, this has been ongoing, of course, in terms of third-party research, certainly not required, testing for safety or toxicity of the vast majority of chemicals used in the United States, particularly pesticides, herbicides, insecticides. Is that correct, that in terms of the testing?
Yeah, absolutely. These chemicals cause widespread health problems in people. And earlier I was talking about how Paul Mueller developed DDT, the first organochlorine pesticide, which became the major class of pesticides in use after World War II. And they were pulled off the market in most of the world in the 1970s because they were highly persistent in the environment, and they were causing the extinction of birds around the world as well as losses of other wildlife. So they were replaced by the organophosphate pesticides. And one of the things that most people don't realize about that replacement is it was a transfer of risk from the consumer to the farm worker. Because the organochlorine pesticides, though they're incredibly damaging to the environment, are pretty safe to apply, and the farm workers using them generally would not have dangerous levels of exposure. But the organophosphate pesticides, which are derived from these Nazi nerve gas weapons, are incredibly dangerous to apply. And so we ended up, but they have a lower residence time in the environment, and so they're less likely to be persisting on the foods that we eat. So we ended up trading better consumer safety in terms of having less residues on our food for more dangerous conditions for the farm worker, where in the United States, most of the farm workers are migrants coming from Latin America, and then they're applying these incredibly toxic chemicals on the fields.
And now that, you mentioned smaller doses getting into the human population, their food and on produce, but we now know actually that there's such a thing as endocrine disruption from these low levels, and that low levels doesn't imply safety, irregardless of whether they're tested legitimately before going to market, but having low levels in and of themselves has proven to be a falsehood in terms of risk. Could you explain maybe a little endocrine disruption?
Sure. So some of these chemicals disrupt hormone function, or so-called endocrine disruptors. And that includes DDT. So DDT would be a good example of this, because if you go back and read the most important book ever written in the environmental sciences, which is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, she deals with a lot of these chemicals, but the one that she spends the most time on is DDT. And at that time, they didn't know how DDT was toxic, other than that it is a nerve agent. They had some understanding of the effects on the brain, but they didn't understand all of these other effects, including its effects on reproduction. And it turns out those are largely due to the endocrine disrupting quality of DDT. So DDT and its metabolites are estrogenic chemicals. They bind to the estrogen receptor and turn on estrogen responses, and that causes feminization of wildlife. And they also have endocrine responses that cause the eggshell thinning. So all of these kinds of things are driven by impacts on the hormone system. And the reason why that relates to your statement about low concentrations is that hormones operate at incredibly small concentrations. So if you have a chemical that's mimicking a hormone or blocking a hormone, it can have an immense impact even at a low concentration. Many chemicals that are endocrine disruptors show what we call a non-monotonic dose response, where they'll have a large effect at a low concentration. The effect will go down as concentrations goes up. They may have some other peaks at higher concentrations because different mechanisms then come into play. But it's a complex process. It's not a simple linear dose response curve. A lot of these chemicals, though, have multiple avenues of toxicity. So one is endocrine disruption, but many of them are also direct nerve agents where they're disrupting function in the brain. And that can be indirectly endocrine disrupting because the brain is the command and control center for the endocrine axis. So it gets complicated in a hurry, but yes, endocrine disruption is an important part of it and explains why low levels can be hazardous to health.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interesting points that made their, that are part of your book. Mueller actually won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1948 for his work discovering DDT. And like so many other, I think, not so much, Nobel Prize winners, but certainly discoveries, chemical compounds that we've discovered, that their downstream effects often cause more harm than anyone ever expected at their invent. So, I think that it's just a very remarkable thing that that was so applauded at the time. And yet now we're seeing that the DDT now exists still in our soil. It is that pervasive and that persistent, like the PFO chemicals, OAs, that PFAS chemicals that are part of Gore-Tex, and stain guard chemicals and grease-proof chemicals and firefighting foams. I feel like there's a lot of parallels to those.
Yeah, there are, and it didn't have to be that way. So if we take DDT as an example of how it could have been, DDT was an amazing tool. In December 1943 to February 1944, the U.S. military used DDT in Naples to stop a typhus outbreak in its tracks. It was the first time in history that a typhus epidemic had been stopped. We used DDT effectively to halt malaria outbreaks that were coming forth at the end of World War II. If we had only used DDT strictly for public health purposes and only in spot treatments in places where the vector was rising up, and that's all we had done with it, it might still be an effective tool today. But we couldn't stop ourselves. We had to put DDT into the wallpaper of nurseries to protect our babies from flies. We had to put it in paint. We had to spray it in our homes in bug bombs by the millions. We had to use it in public parks and concerts so people wouldn't have to be bothered by flies during musical performances. We had to use it in airplanes so that you could fly without any mosquitoes on the plane. And it's that broad-scale use that caused the environmental damage and also made it so that the organisms evolved resistance within a few years, making it no longer effective. And that is that same story of overuse and misuse that we see again and again with each of these chemicals.
Yeah, and resistance, similar to glyphosate, if we can tie it to that popular, the most popular herbicide, I believe, worldwide, still in the United States and certainly Europe. I know it's losing ground in terms of, Mexico is getting, blocking its use. And I think Europe is under discussion with this. But it turns out with glyphosate, as you mentioned with resistance, that it turns out the more spraying is required because of the resistant pests that are basically not succumbing to the effects of Roundup as a killing agent.
Right, and so that's the same story seen with every pesticide. Is there's two parts to it. So one part is the pesticide. If we just take insecticides as an example, when insecticides are applied to fields, not only does it kill the pest insects that eat the crops, like the grasshoppers, it also kills their predators and parasites. And so then you lose the biological control. And at the same time, the pest insect, typically within a couple of years, evolves resistance to that chemical so that either you have to use more of it or you have to use more different kinds of chemicals. And so as an example of this, if you look at the volume of pesticides in use globally in 1962, and you compare it to what was in use, say, in 2000, it would be about twice the volume of chemicals over that time. And I think that would have been appalling to Rachel Carson, that we use more chemicals and more toxic chemicals over time, but it's built into the way that we apply it, because no matter what you want to do, if chemicals are used at that scale, the pests will evolve resistance, and then you have to have new replacement chemicals and more of them in order to have the same effect, especially with the loss of their natural predators and parasites.
Yeah, it's kind of the whack-a-mole phenomenon, seen similarly to chemicals that are used in food packaging, like bisphenol A, which was banned in plastic baby bottles in 2012. But hey, it's in thousands and thousands of other products, and even the substitute for BPA is being touted as sort of its better substitute. When in fact, the regrettable substitution BPS and some of the others have been found to even be the same in terms of its health risks, but even more toxic. So. It looks like we have a trend of this in American history in terms of our chemical production, wouldn't you say?
This concept of regrettable replacement has happened all over the world, and bisphenols are a good example of this, because when it was shown that bisphenol A is toxic, we just replaced it with another bisphenol, which is now known to be toxic, rather than banning the entire class. So we have this constant pattern of banning chemical by chemical, even though those chemicals may belong to a class of hundreds or in some cases thousands of chemicals, like with the perfluoroalkyl substances. And we don't get rid of the whole class. We just say, well, let's get rid of these two individuals of the class that we know are toxic. And we don't know the others are toxic because the resources haven't been there to test them, but they probably are if they have a similar structure.
What countries do it better? I mean, give us an example of some of the countries that are doing it well in terms of what they allow on their market.
Well, I don't think that any country in the world is doing it well, but Europe does it better than the United States. So they have a more precautionary approach than we do. They're taking endocrine disruption more seriously than we do in the United States. And they have banned many of these toxic compounds that are not yet banned in the United States. I would say the United States was doing this really well when we had the flurry of environmental laws between the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act in 1968 and the Superfund Act, which I think was 1976. So that was a period of bipartisan support to combat pollution, to deal with these problems. But it came to a crashing end when Ronald Reagan became president, and it's just been a constant political battle ever since. It's not politicized in the same way in Europe, and so they've been able to make more progress. Like glyphosate is in the process of getting banned throughout most of Europe now, and it should be here in the United States as well. Maybe it will be in the new administration, but we're just way too slow on these things.
And glyphosate, which is Roundup, essentially commercially, is a possible carcinogen by the IARC, I believe, the International Agency on Research on Cancer, and they're trying to move it, I believe, to probable carcinogen, if I'm correct on that.
Yeah, so it's been shown in animal studies to be a probable carcinogenic chemical. We don't know yet with people if it's carcinogenic, but the chances are good that it is. But it has many other adverse effects as well, like it has neurotoxic effects, and so we have to worry about the developing brain of the fetus and of the baby, and there are many other problems associated with it. And that's typical of these chemicals. It's not a single thing. There may be one thing that catches the media attention, like cancer with glyphosate, but typically there are many different avenues of toxicity associated with these chemicals.
Right. It's typically even like the courts and the media that bring it to our attention as the public, because there was huge payouts, multiple cases now showing, lawn workers at schools, for instance, being so exposed to glyphosate Roundup effects that they develop cancers. And there have been some pretty big payouts, which I think is sort of, wouldn't you say, the beginning of the end, you would hope, for this chemical that's now owned by Bayer. I think it was owned by Monsanto and it's now owned by Bayer.
Yeah, it should be the beginning of the end, but it's this problem where if it's such a big deal, it might drive a chemical company to bankruptcy, but then they just reorganize and get back to what they're doing. Their factories are still churning out chemicals, and we're not taking the right approach of preventing them from being on the market in the first place. As a result, you can look at hundreds of different chemicals that are prevalent in the environment and find that we all have them in us. So, for example, one of the chemicals that I work on is called perchlorate, which is a common contaminant of water supplies. And the CDC did a study of thousands of Americans and found that 100% of us have perchlorate in our urine. So we're all exposed to it. It's a thyroid disrupting compound that causes hypothyroidism at high enough concentrations. But we found in my lab, it causes a lot of other health effects as well. So that's typical of these chemicals, and we're exposed to complex mixtures of them, and we have little understanding of how they interact with each other.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I actually, knowing what you're saying about how it disrupts thyroid, and it actually sits often in these transporters of the thyroid gland, being nutritionally insufficient is how I term it, and not having enough iodine in our diet anymore, because it's not supplemented in our bread. It's not supplemented in a lot of people use sea salt, which has no iodine, versus table salt, like Morton sodium table salt that had, iodine added. This combination between poor nutrient sufficiency, and then exposure is really sort of a ticking time bomb, wouldn't you say?
It is, yeah. And actually the Borden Salt Company is a really interesting example, because that was the first example in history of purposeful, healthy-wise endocrine disruption, where we were purposefully disrupting the endocrine system. In this case, we were trying to prevent goiters, because many people were getting goiters because they lived in areas where they were farming where the soil was low in iodine, and therefore they were iodide insufficient, and they developed goiters. They became hypothyroid. So as a public health measure, I think it was the late 1800s, iodine was introduced into table salt, and that pretty much solved the problem of goiters in the United States and in many other parts of the world. So you can look at endocrine disruption both ways. There are these inadvertent endocrine disruptors like the pesticides that aren't designed to disrupt the endocrine system, but they do, and they cause health problems. And there are purposeful ways to disrupt the endocrine system to improve health, like adding iodine into salt.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And there's also medications that are now known to be endocrine disruptors, like tamoxifen, which many people use, which appropriately used at the right doses will work appropriately. But if they're used at a different dose, higher or lower than intended, it can have effects that are similar to endocrine disrupting chemicals. So, it's interesting how these have worked over the years, even our history with DES or diethylsilvestrol, which was used many, many years ago in women and subsequently was taken off the market, but had endocrine disrupting effects that were long lasting generations later.
Yeah, in fact, DES is the poster child of horrible endocrine effects of a medicine where it wasn't intended to have those effects. And then we have other medicines where we know exactly what we're doing to disrupt the endocrine system, like taking melatonin to help sleep. We're purposefully disrupting the endocrine system. So there are all kinds of examples, both inadvertent and purposeful ways to disrupt our hormone function.
Interesting. And then, of course, there's the whole, cleaning industry, cosmetic industry that's purposefully adding, chemicals that are essentially listed as pesticides. They're like triclosan, which was only taken out of liquid hand soap, but is in hundreds of other products and all of its similar chemicals that are antimicrobials. And they're meant to keep cosmetics from having any type of bacterial component to it. And, I was looking for floor tile years ago, and they were marketing in a big box store tile sealant with Macroban or one of the, antibacterials. I took pictures of it. So there's this whole love of cleaning and getting, you said, an uneasy coexistence with pests that also includes bacteria in our cosmetics. And so tell me a little bit about where we are now with modern day pesticides and the excitement over putting this in all of the junk we bring into our home and put on our skin and on our kids' skin.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that consumers are not more educated on this because, the typical family, they have dandelions in their yard, and so they go out and they buy a herbicide to kill it, and they don't realize that they're putting their own children in danger. They're putting their neighbors' kids in danger. They're putting their pets in danger. They're putting the birds in danger that forage in their yard. These are highly toxic chemicals, and the trade-off just isn't worth it. I think that we should only be using pesticides for public health situations where we have an outbreak of a vector-borne disease and we have to control that vector in a particular place. That's where we should use them. Other than that, we shouldn't be using them. Their ill effects on our health and on the environment are just too profound.
Yeah, and it's the whole idea that they're unseen effects, that people, want their lawns to be, and keeping up with the Joneses, the lawns to be perfect, and yet we're carrying those on our shoes and on our pets' paws into the home constantly and exposing ourselves to not just the risk of endocrine disruption and maybe neurotoxicity for fun. There you go, just a few. But then we're also talking about bacterial resistance, where we may actually need an antibiotic at some point for, childbirth or for a hip replacement or something elective. And yet, because we're living around all of these antimicrobial chemicals in our fabrics and our cosmetics, that we may not even respond appropriately to an infection should we actually need it.
That's right. And now we have dangerous microbial diseases that are having outbreaks that we can't stop because of the overuse of these antimicrobial agents. So it's a huge issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. What do you think in terms of our another ecosystem that's gotten a lot of attention over the past couple of decades is our gut microbiome? And what are your thoughts regarding that ecosystem in terms of contaminated drinking water or stress or anything that changes the balance and interplay between those really incredible microbes that live within us?
Right. So we have more microbial cells in our body than we have human cells. And it's not just the gut microbiome, but there's a microbiome in the vagina, in the mouth, in the nose, and the eyes. I mean, we have a microbiome in many different parts of our body. And that microbiome, it turns out, plays an important and underappreciated role in our health that we're just learning more and more about all the time. So even to the extent where people with some health problems are getting fecal transplants in order to populate their microbiome with a more healthy mixture. So there's some treatments that sound pretty disgusting, but they appear to be effective for a number of different illnesses. And
fecal, you're talking about fecal transplant?
Fecal transplants, yeah.
So literally taking some cleaned version of someone's poop and using it as a suppository. I don't think it's oral at this point, but as a suppository, which has reduced the death of thousands of potential people from C. difficile, which is often an antibiotic-induced resistant infection seen in hospitals around the world, but even in the United States.
Exactly. And so we were talking about the overuse of antibiotics just recently, and that is, I'm sure, why you asked about this, because as we overuse antibiotics, we also disrupt or wipe out our gut microbiome, which plays key signaling roles in our health, and including in our endocrine system. We're just learning about these interrelationships, but we know they play an important role in health. And so that's yet another reason to not overuse antibiotics and to be doing things that support the microbiome, such as eating active cultures of these things like you would get in yogurt, for example.
Yeah, it's a great advice. Integrative and functional, and all these health conscious health practitioners often, try to get people to, reduce pesticides on your food, whether it's organics or you're just washing it off with white vinegar or baking soda. Managing stress, which changes the pH of these very important bacteria and microbes. And watching contaminated drinking water, which I'm sure you've had a lot of experience with contaminated drinking water in certain populations, how that wipes out good guys too. So yeah, I think, when you get people who are doing the bench research and the field work that you do, and you're tying it to the actual clinical practice and what I actually tell patients, I think it's a remarkable storyline. Anyway, speaking of storyline, back to your book. So you recently released this book. I think it came out in September 2020.
That's right.
And, you must have handed it in for printing, I would say, several months before that. So, tell me a little bit, right before COVID really hit, before we kind of knew we were in this, what, from your vantage point, I'm just fascinated with what you've written. What is your take on where we are now, in any which way you want to describe it?
Sure. So in terms of the book, it was actually scheduled to come out May 1st. And because of the pandemic, the publication was delayed until September because everything closed. Amazon wasn't taking new books. All the bookstores closed. So the publisher just delayed publication until September. And because the book because one of the 4 sections of the book is on pandemics, I was, of course, disappointed about the delay, but I also understood it wasn't on people's minds to read a book when this whole thing started. And now finally people are in a position where we have the mental space to be reading a book and learning more about these kinds of things. But yeah, the pandemic has been something I never expected to go through. And I've studied pandemics extensively in researching this book, and even before. I'm actually here because of the 1918 influenza pandemic, because my grandfather's first wife died in childbirth, and she had influenza during that pandemic, and so he remarried my grandmother, and that's why the line that I'm part of is here. So I exist because of a prior pandemic, and probably many of us are. We tend to forget this, but just as an example that relates to stuff we were talking about earlier, if you're an Irish American, you're probably in this country because of the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. And you could go through different ethnic groups, and probably a lot of your history has to do with the impact of these pandemics. It was kind of a nonstop impact on people's lives until these modern chemicals and modern medicine solved many of these problems with antibiotics and other treatments. So it is surreal to be living through this time right now, and it feels surreal to me, having studied the reaction of past people to pandemics. I was really worried when it started that our society would collapse, because that's happened so many times with past pandemics. My wife and daughter both got COVID at the beginning of March, so they were some of the people to get it first in Arizona, and that was actually kind of a relief, because my boys and I quarantined with them, and we didn't get sick, and they both fully recovered. And so, having gone through it earlier, I think that was much less stressful for me than for people who are just anticipating. It's hard to not know what's coming, right? That's very difficult for people. And so, in a way, getting through it early was a positive thing for me. But it's a terrible tragedy. Over 250,000 Americans have died, and similar mortality rates in some of the other countries that haven't handled it well, like we have not handled it well here.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I hope they recovered well and don't have any significant kind of long hauler effects, which we're now learning about, unfortunately, with a lot of patients having ongoing symptoms, assuming that, people lived through it and didn't have any, didn't pass away. There's some chronic issues that everyone's worried about as well. But that's quite interesting how personally it affected you. And, I wanted to save this last question, sort of for the end, or a couple last questions. Your epilogue in your book was quite extraordinary. I thought it was actually so unique and interesting to read your personal family history connected to this whole topic, which not many authors have a personal, to this extent, connection to the history of chemicals and even World War I and II, and then also your great grandfather who won, what was it, the Nobel Prize, right? So please give us a little history and share with us sort of this incredible family that you come from and how you've ended up right here and now with this extraordinary piece of work.
Well, thank you, Ailey. I don't want to give too much away, because it is kind of a nice thing to read after reading the book, and I would recommend people read the epilogue last. But I'm actually a first-generation American. So my father was born in Germany, my mother was born in Austria, and they were both child refugees with their parents out of Nazi Germany. And my parents are both Jewish. And but my great-grandfather was James Franck, and he did the experimental demonstration of Bohr's theory of atomic structure. And but he was pretty intimately involved with the entire history that we've talked about, from being Haber's assistant during World War I through being in charge of the chemistry division of the Manhattan Project of World War II for the United States. And my grandfather Arthur von Hippel was also involved in many of the aspects of this history, because he ran a major material science lab for the U.S. military out of MIT during World War II after they immigrated to the country. So maybe best if we leave it there. But in my, you have families where the family trade is the shop that goes from generation to generation. And in my family, it happens to be science that goes generation to generation.
Yeah, so it's a wonderful history, and you even have ties to Princeton here where I am and practicing. So that'll be interesting for people to read about. I wanted to jump into a kind of an issue that's been popped up much, much more over the last several years, certainly with the elections and political discourse, is this concept of distrust of science by both the public, the media, and how sort of we fall into this pattern of, we saw it with World War II, we've seen it throughout history, even back with the potato famine. What is your thoughts on this concept of distrust of science and how that can be popularized in a negative way to really affect millions of lives in terms of health and illness?
I think it's really insidious. And in fact, if you go back through these examples you mentioned, like the potato famine and many of the pandemics that we've talked about, the distrust in science led to far greater mortalities than would have had to happen otherwise. So, for example, when the germ theory of disease was developed and scientists developed effective vaccines beginning in the late 1800s against many of these diseases, in many places, the public didn't trust the scientists, and the public health workers refused to get the vaccine, and that caused these epidemics to tear through those places. So it's terrible for society, and what most people, I think, don't realize is that science is self-correcting. So if a scientist says something is true, another scientist will come along and test it and either replicate it or falsify it. So because scientists are regular people, you get people who make mistakes, you get people who lie, you get people who do the wrong thing, but it's self-correcting. Unlike in politics, where you can make something up and lie about it and carry that lie forward for a long time, like Hitler did, and like we see with the Trump administration of just making up so many lies and getting so many people to believe it, as we're seeing right now with the denial of a fair election in the United States. So I think it's a huge problem, this distrust of science. And actually, it was the attacks by the Trump administration on science when he became president that motivated me to start my podcast. And I was thinking to myself, what can I do as an individual to combat these attacks on science? And I decided that maybe the most effective thing I could do was to do a science history podcast. So and it's the same with writing about these issues. It can help to battle it, but it is a terrible aspect that's increasing in our society. It's this mistrust of science.
Yeah, and I'm always, I don't want to push people to ever talk politics if they don't want to or they don't feel comfortable. So I leave it up to the guest, and I'm also very surprised by what people often say. So I'm glad you spoke, your truth and helped to let everyone know that there's a lot of truths out there that are being pushed under the table for political purposes, and it's really not easy for the general public to decipher that out. So we have to keep on, pushing truth and science and data. What are your thoughts on the warp speed development of a potential new COVID vaccine, given that it takes often years? I mean, malaria, which I was fascinated by when I read about a malaria and mentioned in your book that it went back as far as 2700 BC. Greek physician Hippocrates described malaria in 500 BC, just the enormous death toll. And yet we don't even have a vaccine for malaria, which is really kind of hard to wrap my head around. And even our treatments are so limited. So how do you rationalize the fact that we have this warp speed COVID vaccine or 2 or 3, and yet we couldn't even kind of conquer malaria in terms of that death toll?
Yeah, it's a great question. And kind of the parallel would be, why is it that we've had the birth control for women since the late 1950s, and we still don't have a birth control for men, a pill for men, right?
Yay, I love that one. Woo! Okay.
But I think the answer is that it's more difficult. And so we would have a vaccine for malaria if it were an easy problem to solve. It's not an easy problem to solve. And I actually think that this warp speed development of the COVID vaccine is fantastic. And the reason why, my understanding is the reason why they've been able to develop now three effective vaccines so quickly is that the new technology of them, this messenger RNA vaccine, has been in development for about 20 years. It just wasn't in development for COVID, but it was in development. And so when COVID came along, many scientists realized that this would be an effective way to treat COVID, and they could develop it quickly. I think it's developed more quickly than I was expecting, which is great. The effectiveness is higher than many of us expected, which is great, right? The two that are closest are about 95% effective. And so I think it's a fantastic development that's going to get us out of this horrible situation that we're in. And my hope is that this incredibly productive development of vaccines gets turned into a nonstop way to fight existing and new diseases that emerge. And we were talking politics a minute ago, and the Trump administration disbanded the office that would have been dealing with this that the Obama administration had set up, and so handicapped us from the beginning. We need to have robust and effective and well-funded infectious disease programs here and around the world. And it's going to happen again. We're getting these diseases emerge like HIV and SARS and MERS and COVID because of the fact that we're continually invading new habitat, people are eating bush meat, getting infected by animals with zoonotic diseases that then pass through the human population. It's going to keep happening, and we need to have effective ways to do it. It's also been so fast because of the amazing genomic and bioinformatic tools that we have now, where you can actually do high throughput screening of compounds. You can look at the structure of a protein very accurately. These things were not possible even 10 or 15 years ago. So the technology that has recently emerged has facilitated this rapid development.
You described, some of the things we talked about was prevention. Don't buy products with antimicrobials, don't buy Roundup, don't spray your lawns, don't, versus sort of treatment of the problem afterwards, downstream effects. Do you think technology will save us, essentially, either humans or the earth? I mean, do you think that we're smart enough to save ourselves in many ways?
Yeah, technology is a two-edged sword, and these chemicals are an example of that, where they've caused tremendous ecological and health damage around the world, but they can also be used very effectively to stop epidemics and pandemics and to treat a variety of medical conditions. So unfortunately, we haven't been wise in the deployment of technology, and we need that transition in our society where each of these technologies, we think through ahead of time, what are the consequences of using it? What scale should we use it at? And probably the answer is it should be used in a targeted way, not broadcast throughout the world. And I mean, the fact that we're still mining is an admission of failure, because metals aren't destroyed in their use. Why don't we reuse all the metals that we use? Why do they go to the landfill and then we have to mine more metals? So we live unsustainably, and that can't continue if humanity is going to continue in a productive way. We have to change the way that we do these things.
You have kids. I have kids. What do you wish for the future? Or, are you hopeful?
Yeah, I'm dispositionally an optimistic person. And so I have a hard time not being hopeful, even though I know about all these problems and I teach and study these problems. But I am hopeful. And especially, it seems like my kids' generation is more concerned and more active in wanting to do something about these problems. We see it most intensively with trying to combat climate change, but climate change is just one of the existential problems that we face. And I am hopeful that this next generation is much more attuned and will do a better job than prior generations in cleaning up the world and being more sustainable in the way that we do things.
That's a great note to end on. So, thank you for contributing and giving us perspective on this huge topic. How can people, read your book? Tell us the title again and where they can find it. And then also tell us a little bit about your podcast, which I find fascinating. And so our listeners can listen to your podcast.
Sure. Thanks, Haley. So the book is called The Chemical Age. It's published by the University of Chicago Press, and you can get it at any bookstore or online at any store. And the podcast is called the Science History Podcast. So if you Google that, you'll find it. And it's a once-a-month podcast on all aspects of science history. We've covered topics as far afield as the connection between Winston Churchill and science, and talking parrots and space science, and even science and poetry, to more political topics like dark money in science and the corruption of scientific enterprises by governments such as the Trump administration. So it's quite a varied podcast, but monthly on all topics of science history with world leaders on these topics.
That's wonderful. And I hope people will listen and also read. This book was extraordinary. It was really fascinating. So thank you for, writing this amazing piece of literature. Thank you, Dr. Frank von Hippel, who is professor of ecotoxicology at Northern Arizona University. It was really a pleasure to talk with you and to pick your brain. And, I look forward to talking to you in the future. So good luck with all of your amazing research and projects.
Thanks, Haley. And I also appreciate that you take on this issue from the patient perspective of what can people do to solve these problems for themselves. Because I think we're attacking these problems from different sides, and both sides are needed to solve these problems.
Yeah, I appreciate that as well because it's a big story, and anywhere we can intervene, any of us, I think, is really something to be shared and discussed further. So, thank you for that. All right, well, thank you, everybody, and stay tuned for our next the Smart Human podcast and new interviews to come. Have a wonderful day and be well.